back to the Intimacy Secrets Summit. I am so excited for our next guest. I'm sure you mostly all recognize her, but she is Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife. She's an LDS relationship and sexuality coach, as well as a licensed clinical professional counselor in the state of Illinois. She has her PhD in counseling psychology. Her teaching and coaching focuses on helping LDS individuals and couples achieve greater satisfaction and passion in their emotional and sexual relationships. And I am so grateful you're here. Hello, Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. This is one of my favorites. So that was your professional fancy interview. What do you really want the summit viewers to know about you?
I just have a lot of passion for helping couples to create more happiness in their lives by having better relationships, because our relationship to ourselves and our relationship to others is so linked to joy and so linked to happiness. It's like the most important thing, more important than wealth or social status or anything like that. So helping people to grow into more capacity is what I do through the teaching I do and the coaching I do. And so it's just something I really care about. It's very meaningful work.
Yes, and you are absolutely one of my favorite people to listen to, because I absolutely agree with you. I think our relationships with ourselves and others are the most important predictors of our happiness and what we will eventually do in the world. So
Yeah.
I love how you break it down and make it so clear. So since this whole summit is about intimacy, I want to start by just asking you, what is real intimacy and what does it take to create an intimate marriage?
Well, what I think of intimacy is, I think we tend to really like the idea of intimacy, but in reality, I find that people are very ambivalent about intimacy. That is, that they want it, but they don't want it. And that's because intimacy is really about letting yourself be knowable as you are, not just the good parts, not just the parts that make you, likable, but everything about you, the good parts and the underdeveloped parts and the not so nice parts. And so I think that intimacy is the tolerance of being knowable to yourself as a human being, as a flawed person, as a person in development, and also letting someone else know you, right? So you know yourself and let yourself be known, and knowing your spouse or your child or anyone that you want a close and meaningful relationship with, which is hard in its own right, because often the aspects of your spouse or your child you don't want to know. I mean, because it doesn't validate you, or it doesn't give you what you want them to be, or how you'd like for them to think, or we often want the people close to us to validate aspects of ourselves or give us the things that we want. And so we'll often be resistant to knowing our spouse or other important people in our lives. But in short, intimacy is to know and be known, and it's harder than it looks.
Absolutely. So if we actually wanted to create an intimate marriage, what do we have to do?
Yeah. You have to basically tolerate letting yourself be knowable and resist the instinct to mask who you are, or to get upset at your spouse when they expose and see who you are, right? A lot of times we're saying you just don't understand, when in reality they do understand, and they are just talking about a part of yourself that you don't want to recognize or acknowledge. And so marriage is so well designed to expose parts of ourselves, but often we want to shoot the messenger or say there's something broken about the marriage, rather than that the marriage is showing us our limited development. So it takes a lot of courage to know yourself and to be honest, and to stop getting upset at your spouse, and to start not fight with them, but fight with yourself more around what you know is a liability or a limitation that you would do well to work with if you're going to be an easier person to be partnered with, and if you're going to be more at peace with yourself. So it takes a lot of courage. I don't know how else you do marriage well except to have courage and to dare to be honest about yourself and honest about what you see in your spouse.
So I wasn't planning on asking you this, but
Mm,
your answer just begs the question. I think when we're talking about a relationship,
mm,
a lot of times I feel like we see what we want to see and not
yeah.
necessarily what's really there. Can you talk
Yes.
about that for a moment? And like maybe if we feel like our spouse is only seeing what they want to see, or
Yeah. Well, yeah, and your spouse may be colluding with you and only showing the parts that they think you can handle or they think they can handle. But yeah, a lot of times we have ideas about what we want to have be true about our spouse, how they feel about us, how they feel about the world, how they feel about their faith. And so they may be giving indicators of who they are, even if unwittingly, that you go blind to because it's distressing. You don't want to know it. I've told this in some other podcasts where my son was having a hard time. And instead of listening to him, I kept trying to coach him on how he should do it differently. And at a certain point, he's like, Mom, you're a terrible listener. And, I'm a professional listener. So he's telling me I'm a terrible listener. And if I were talking to him as if he were someone else's kid, I would have been a good listener because it doesn't impact me. But because I didn't want to know the way that he was struggling and I just wanted to fix it, correct it, not really understand it and know that it was his burden to sort out, I just kept not wanting to see it or understand it, which was extremely unhelpful. But that was about my own anxiety about what I don't have control over. And so I kept just trying to solve him.
yeah. So that's I guess, a dangerous pitfall. We have to realize,
Yep.
be open to seeing everything, even if we don't necessarily want to.
Right. And how much it's linked to calming ourselves down, especially around a spouse or a child or a friend, around what we don't have control over. It's one of the challenging things of life is tolerating what you do have control over and what you don't. And I think often what you don't have control over is even harder because that's why we want to go blind to things because we're not sure we can handle what's true. Mm-hmm.
So, what are some common roadblocks to intimacy besides seeing things from our own?
Well, yeah. So one is what we just talked about is this desire to kind of limit our growth. We like homeostasis. We like the familiar. We like staying where in the areas that we've already kind of mastered. And so because growth is uncomfortable and disruptive, we resist growth, even though growth always expands our lives and makes us freer. But it's just hard. It's just, you have to tolerate the anxiety and the uncertainty of it. So there's this kind of resistance to growth. But there's also a tricky thing, which is that in my experience, is that couples create collusions. And what I mean by that is couples often partner with each other in a way that justifies the limitations in both persons. So, for example, a lot of times in relationships, when we fear the fundamental question of our desirability or our sufficiency, which most of us do in our 20s when we get married, because we haven't had enough life experience to kind of come to peace with ourselves. And so what we do in our relationships is we kind of want a type of collateral or a type of security. And so a lot of times how people do this, one very typical collusion that expresses itself in a lot of iterations is somebody is looking for protection in their partner. They want somebody who's overtly stronger or more dominant or more opinionated or more directed in their lives. And the other person wants to be needed. So they want somebody who will kind of defer to them and depend on them and need them. That's a very typical collusion, but they're both needy positions. If you need to be needed, that means you need for someone to be dependent on you because you're afraid otherwise they would leave you. They wouldn't stay with you except that they get goods from you. So these are both dependent and immature positions, but because they hook into each other, they're hard to break because one person growing up stresses out the other one. Because let's say you need to be needed, and your needy spouse starts to become more autonomous and more comfortable with herself, we'll say, that the person who needs to be needed may actually try to create more situations where she would self-doubt because he doesn't want to lose his role. So that's the other tricky thing, is oftentimes you're in a pattern that you both depend upon. So you don't just have yourself to fight with, you also have your spouse who's resisting change as well. And that's one of the trickiest things, is to really break pattern best is when you have two people. It's easiest if two people are confronting their own role. But the anxiety in the couple will go up as you're trying to step into new ways of knowing yourself. The overfunctioner knowing more of their vulnerability, the underfunctioner knowing more of their strength. That's unsettling because it's sort of giving birth to a new understanding of yourself. And it's easy to kind of collapse back into the old pattern, even unwittingly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So a lot of these things are kind of happening in the unconscious, right?
That's right. That's right.
So how can we build intimacy in our marriage as we kind of go through these seasons of learning and confronting these types of patterns in our marriage?
So I have maybe 3 ideas about that. One is, the more you can see your pattern, you can't change what you can't see. Mm-hmm. So a good therapist, a good coach, just self-awareness is really helpful for being open to your spouse's feedback. You can often figure out what you're doing that's regressed or immature if you kind of let yourself be taught, let people that are not, when you're in your own pattern, it's very easy to go blind to it. So a lot of times you need somebody who's on the outside who can see what you're doing. So that self-awareness is gold. It always hurts. It's uncomfortable at first. You can feel defensive. But if you can let yourself see it, you're actually, then you've got a chance to not fall into this blind spot or this trap. So self-awareness is one. And then very linked to that is 2 things that for me is that I just push myself to be as honest with myself as I can. That isn't a flawless system. There's still things I can't see. But if I'm saying to myself, what am I pretending not to know? What is it that I want to not deal with? What is it that I don't want to look at? Because oftentimes there's something there. I think it's Jung that said, like what you need most in your life is often in the places you least want to look. There's something there that scares you, something that you don't want to understand about yourself or your spouse. But that courage to be honest is a big deal because it just increases your intelligence, your emotional intelligence, your ability to see what's real. Having a good roadmap of life is essential to not living with regrets. And so it takes courage to wake up and see. And then I think a third mechanism for me is when I am in a reaction. So how do I know when I'm reactive? Because if I'm reactive, I'm regressed. If I feel younger than my actual age, I know I'm regressed. So if I say to myself, how old do I feel? And it's a day shy of my actual age, I have a good indicator that I'm in a reaction. And that's a good time to stop talking, to settle down, and to confront, what am I doing right now? Am I in one of my old patterns? Why am I, what am I trying to control? Often your spouse or your child or your parent or whatever, instead of yourself. And so if you just feel, you just know your blood pressure is going up, your speech is accelerating, however you get regressed, some people get silent. But if you know what it is that you're doing when you're in a reaction and you can track it, it's a good opportunity to stop yourself, calm your mind down, and see if you can self-confront your way into a wiser position. And by self-confront, it's like, what am I doing? How am I participating in the problem? You might be like, well, I know how my spouse is. They're doing it. And you might well be right, but don't use that to be blind to how you're a part of your spouse's reactivity, why they feel justified in saying what they just said. How am I a part in this? And it can help to be like, well, if my friend were doing this, what would be my advice to her or him? If, my son-in-law and daughter were doing this, what would be my advice? Because a lot of times you can pull yourself back a bit and get wiser and know how to function differently.
Yeah, I love that so much. I think a great question that we can ask ourselves once we start this awareness of the pattern, once we start to see like this is the pattern we fall into, a great question is to step back and go, what do I do that pulls my spouse into this pattern?
Exactly.
Really aware of your own.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And so sometimes if I've seen my spouse do something I don't like, I know what my role is in that. And then I'm like, oh, yep, I bet I'm doing that.
Yeah. I'm doing that thing that pulls them into their thing.
And go deal with my half of it. That's all I have control over, but it makes a big difference.
Yeah. So good. So good. So what if someone's sitting here thinking like, this is a lot, like, I'm just not good at intimacy. Like this just isn't my thing. Is there a way to increase our capacity for intimacy?
Oh, like 1,000%. Yes. Because your capacity for intimacy is not about how extroverted you are or how introverted you are. You know, my husband's an extreme introvert and has probably more capacity for intimacy than I do. So that is your ability to know someone without becoming reactive, to be at peace with yourself while you're in the face of someone else's invalidation. That's something, if we're living honestly and courageously and tolerating what is more than trying to force what we wish were, in fact, the case, the more ability we have to live wisely and non-reactively in life, the more tolerance we have for knowing other people, the more tolerance we have for knowing ourselves. You know, one of the nice things about being in your 50s, which I am now, is like, you know, it's like any fantasy that I'm going to be perfect or that, I don't know, there's a level of self-acceptance that gets easier the farther along you go, and the less you're trying to get other people to think you're okay. And the more you can just settle down about this whole human experience and be at deeper ease. And the more you can do that, the more gratefully you can live, the more you can value your friendship and partnership, the more you can value the differences. And I think it just comes with living life honestly and well. Over time, you just have an expanded capacity. So absolutely, this is something that people are getting, as long as they're not just trying to control everybody and they're living honestly, people are getting better at it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's so great. I feel like every decade I get a little bit better at just loving what is. That's exactly. So great. I love it. I love it. So let's talk quickly, because there's a lot of people that are going to be talking about emotional intimacy. And then there's a huge portion of people that are going to be talking about sexual intimacy. So let's talk for a second about how does our ability or capacity for emotional intimacy affect the sexual intimacy in our relationship?
Yeah, well, so the way I think about it is that true emotional intimacy is highly linked to sexual intimacy. So that is that if you're someone who's capable of emotional intimacy, and I'll just give one little caveat, is a lot of times people can be friendly, they can be affectionate, but there is still a lot of guardedness in the relationship, even if they know how to be affable and they would say we're good friends. So I have couples who say we're good friends, but we have no desire to have sex. And I think what's actually going on is there's still quite a bit of superficiality in the emotional relationship, because emotional and sexual intimacy are highly linked in reality, because it's very much connected to how much you truly accept who you are, embodied and sexual as you are. And a lot of us are like, oh yeah, I'm totally cool with myself from the neck up. But everything else down there, I'm anxious about, I'm unsettled about, so I don't want to let anybody in on it. And while we might want to make a kind of false division, if you really aren't at peace in your own skin and in your embodied state and as a sexual being, it's very hard to truly be at ease with yourself, because you're running from something, you're afraid of something, you're afraid of yourself relative to something. And so you're not really at peace in your own skin. And a sexually intimate relationship is really about partners who are sexual friends, who do accept themselves, do value their sexuality, and value one another, and they can share their sexuality with each other. They can love through it. It's a part of self-expression. It's a kind of embodied expression of love, to both give it and receive it. But you can't love through the language of sexuality unless you have come to terms with it, unless you trust yourself with it, unless you trust your partner with it. And, sex isn't good or bad. Sex is what we do with it, and what do we create through our sexuality, which is closer to the bone. It's just deeper, but it's very much linked to friendship if it's going to be a good part of your life. And so if you're really, really going to be good friends as marriage partners, because we're sexual and it's really going to be an intimate relationship, it's inclusive of sexuality. Unless both people have no interest in the erotic and they really don't relate to that, it still might be an affectionate relationship. But I suppose if both people had no interest, maybe so. But I think that this is just a kind of fundamental part of being human for the great majority of us. And so how do we love each other through that? That's essential to really having a psychological and emotional home.
Whoa, that's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, sorry, I get so used to these ideas that I just
I love it. Well, I love it so much, but I'm trying to think like, if I'm sitting here going, okay, I recognize we're friends, we're partners, we get things done, we're good at being married, but this sexual aspect of our relationship is definitely not where it could be. Give us like some first steps. Like, what are a couple things we could look at to maybe decide whether or not we want to really expand our relationship in that way?
Well, oh gosh, I'm trying to keep it as brief as I can. I mean, I think where I would start is that in reality, a lot of times you have a high desire person and a low desire person, right? And it looks like the low desire person has sexual anxiety, and it looks like the high desire person does not. But in reality, usually both have very similar levels of doubt around the legitimacy of sexuality and their comfort with it. Even the high desire person, what they're doing is they're trying to get their lower desire spouse to make their sexuality and their desirability legitimate. Mm-hmm. And so they're kind of trying to prove that they're okay through trying to get the other person to love them through sex. So what often happens is people make it the problem of the other person rather than dealing with themselves around their relationship to sexuality and dealing with themselves around their capacity for friendship and care in a marriage. And that's the first step, is you start looking at your own role in the problem of a sexual relationship that you don't like or that makes you anxious, whether you're higher desire or lower desire. What's my role in this? A lot of times the low desire person is kind of putting it all on the high desire person and acting like a victim of it rather than really thinking about how do we create a marriage and a sexual relationship that's more intimate, that's more of a friendship, that's a place that I would like to, in fact, be. What would I need to change or address to make it be something desirable? It's easier to almost think of it as, oh yeah, Wednesday nights I put out and, and just keep it at this kind of superficial martyr place because it asks less of us than really stepping in and being invested honestly in creating a home for two in the sexual realm.
Oh my gosh, that's so good. So good. Okay, well, I get this rare opportunity to get to know you a little more personally with this next question. So let's imagine you wake up one day and you realize you've let all the things of life, business, kids, get in the way or take precedence over your partner, and you're feeling disconnected. So what would you personally do in your own relationship to rebuild, reignite the spark, and bring the fun back into your partnership?
Okay, I was thinking about that. So what would I do? I mean, I think what I would be thinking about is, first of all, why have I been letting that happen? Because at least for me, I would think there's an anger or something for me where if I were letting that happen, that it's a kind of a punishment or like a way of saying, I'm going to go prioritize these other things, I can use the idea that I'm busy to not address or deal with something here that's harder to deal with. So I think I would be looking at what have I been trying to avoid. So it's not just that busyness has, sometimes that happens, but seldom are couples, or at least in my relationship, I don't think that leads to a kind of anger or distance so much as you're kind of looking forward to being with each other again. But if there's like a distance, I think that's more linked to anger. So I would want to see what is creating it and what am I avoiding and what do I need to address more directly, and stop using the excuse of all the busyness. I'm busy, so I don't mean to say that it's like pretend, but it's being used to avoid something. And I think avoiding that, addressing that honestly and looking at myself and the problem, at least for me, creates more trust, more honesty, more closeness, more intimacy. If I was also thinking like, would just be nice to go do more things together. I think for me, it's like going and doing things just with John rather than with the kids around. It's a way of kind of keeping this idea of us being a couple as primary. So it's just creating more opportunities to just be ourselves and be a couple outside of all these other roles. And, that's always desirable for me personally. If there's something that I'm mad about, then that probably wouldn't be desirable. But if I'm dealing with what that is, then finding that time to be a couple is definitely a plus.
Such a great answer. I love it. Okay, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today. Can you tell the viewers where they can find more of you and all of your fantastic wisdom that you're constantly giving out?
Sure. So on my website, which is just my last name, it's Finlayson-Fife.com. So Finlayson-Fife.com. On there, you can find my podcast archive, which is just interviews on all kinds of topics: spirituality, sexuality, intimacy, communication, all kinds of things. So you can find those there. I also have 5 online courses that are about how to create a richer emotional and sexual relationship. So a men's course and a women's course, it's about developing your own sexuality and your own peace with your sexuality, and then 2 couples courses, and then a how to talk to your kids about sex course. So that's all there. And I'll just say this last thing, we are about to launch a new podcast that's just mine called Room for Two, and it's going to be where I'm doing couples coaching around intimacy, sex and intimacy issues, and giving couples feedback so that people just have another way to kind of process these ideas in a really practical, real life setting. So
very excited for that.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you again so much.
Thanks for having me.